And in just a few days, the G20 Leaders Summit will begin here in Bali. Holding the group's presidency this year, how could Indonesia use this opportunity to demonstrate leadership and high commitment to various strategic and challenging issues for the global community? And joining me today, what an honor for the conversation, is the Assistant Secretary General and CEO of the United Nations Global Compact. So we are very honored to be joined by Ms. Sanda Ojambo. Thank you very much. What an honor, Ms. Sanda.
Well, thank you very much for having me. It's a real pleasure to be here.
I cannot begin to imagine a million things that you have to take care of, and making your time to stop by, it means a lot to us. Ms. Sanda, first and foremost, we are aware that the G20 this year under Indonesia's presidency is a G20 deliberations in a time unlike any others. We just recovered from an excruciating global COVID-19 pandemic, and including with that exacerbated by the global geopolitical tensions. So how do you view our presidency up to this point?
Yeah. Well, first, congratulations to Indonesia for hosting the G20. I just arrived yesterday, and really impressive arrangements, and what I've seen attending the B20 meetings, which kicked off today. Yeah. Look, the crises that you describe are ones that have held essentially the whole world captive. COVID, conflict, and the climate crisis as a whole. Whether you're a developed nation or developing or an emerging economy, we certainly have been in 2 or 3 years of turbulence. But I think for the private sector, what is demonstrated now more than ever is that, for the solutions that we face across the world, no one sector can challenge them alone. So it's imperative for governments and the public sector to work hand in hand with the private sector, with civil society, with the UN, to help us get through this current very turbulent moment.
Yeah. And Indonesia has also been proposing the concept of multilateralism for all countries to come together. Recover together, recover stronger, the big main theme of our G20 presidency this year. And as you mentioned, simultaneously, one of the most anticipated summit, the B20 summit, has just taken place here in Nusa Dua, Bali. What do you think are some of the most significant outcomes from this summit that can truly change the landscape of economic recovery post the COVID-19 pandemic?
Yeah, that's a really good question. First, let me just pick up on the theme of multilateralism, because I think that it's really important now more than ever. We need a united world. We need a world where we focus again on what is the global public good. As I said, we've gone through extreme turbulence on the pandemic, on the climate crisis, which is before us, and also on the fact that many economies are not performing as they should. This is a time when nations, I think, should look at how we function as a multilateral system and not function unilaterally. But to the B20, the morning sessions have really looked at a key issue on blended finance, and that's been a very big theme here, with Indonesia again showing great leadership in terms of blended financing models. And this is really the opportunity to bring together private capital, and there's hundreds of trillions of dollars sitting there, perhaps not optimally used towards supporting sustainable development, that could be blended with public finance, unleashing a lot more financing available, one for the energy and the climate transitions, but I think also to allow better access to finance for a lot of developing and emerging economies that are not able to access funding and financing in a same way that is equitable and accessible for their economies.
Yeah. Do you think there's enough commitment from all these stakeholders, from what you've observed at the B20, all of these diverse capitals coming in to sort of help the missions of G20 to come true, particularly attacking the subject of sustainability, something that the result we cannot see in immediate future, but let's say 10, 20, even 30 years from now?
Well, look, I think any business leader who does, chooses to ignore the long-term prospects then has no intention of being in business for a long term. The climate crisis is on us. You can't ignore that. Indonesia itself, I know, has been ravaged in many ways by climate adversity. The other day, Pakistan, over 1,000 people lost due to the floods. All around the world, the climate crisis is staring at us right in the face. So that's just one angle of sustainability. But I do think, to your question as to whether or not there's commitment, I think we're discussing now frameworks. It's incumbent upon the holders of capital, be they in the private sector, be it philanthropy, and certainly public sector, to come together and look at what these configurations would look like. So it's one of those where I think the rubber really needs to hit the road, but I think the cause and the urgency must be top of mind, I believe, for everybody. We're at an extreme time of economic crisis, lots of countries and economies going into debt, others on the brink of of debt, inflation worldwide, I don't think there's any more clearer signals that we need right now for action.
Well, some countries have admitted they have gone into recession at the moment, and the looming recession for others are undeniable and also unavoidable at some point. Bringing me to my next question to you, Ms. Sanda, because here, at the G20, we're aware that there are certain ethics and also principles promoted by the UN Global Compact. Do you think that these calamities that we're facing at the moment have, in a way, hindered the projections of implementation and or adoption of those ethics and principles?
Well, for sure, what the crisis that we've gone through have done is impacted progress on the Sustainable Development Goals. As you know, the SDGs were a framework that was announced in 2015 for global prosperity. And the very fact that the three crises we face have diverted resources and diverted attention to resolving the crisis means that other issues such as general health, education, gender equality, a decent work and economic growth have suffered. We at the UN do still see the Sustainable Development Goals as a strong framework for getting through the current crises. And it is our hope as we move towards the midpoint of the SDGs next year that we can refocus attention towards that. But to your point also about the principles of the Global Compact, which are grounded in human rights, labor, the environment, and anti-corruption, they are mirrored through the Sustainable Development Goals. We believe that businesses that are responsible will take cognizance of those rights and principles and use them to make their businesses more sustainable and more competitive and more resilient over time.
Wow. Well, it's interesting you touch on the SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals, because this has been something that have been delayed to a point where we don't see it happening anytime soon due to the global COVID-19 pandemic, the ongoing geopolitical tensions. Do you think at any time in the near future that we will see significant progress globally towards achieving the SDGs?
Well, as acknowledged, I think progress has faltered due to the crises we've had. Next year marks a midpoint or a stock take of the Sustainable Development Goals. I believe we will see a renewed call to action, both for governments, for private sector, civil society and other actors to really come to table. But you know, the SDGs should not be alien to any national government. Many national development plans encompass a lot of the SDGs. Things such as access to healthcare for all, things such as education through the lifelong cycle, gender equality, guaranteeing jobs and economic growth. Very much mirrored. I think it's just been 2 or 3 years of unprecedented global crises that has thrown us off track.
Right. So the concept of sustainability and all the green projects, from what we're aware, we spoke to the chairman yesterday, was that one of the main concepts proposed at the table of the 3 Hitakarana Forum, which you also attended today. So how did it go? Did you see enough interest from all the private capitals, from our philanthropists across the globe that have flown in to Bali, also attended virtually, to sort of, get together and provide the financial support for these noble projects for our Mother Earth?
Well, it was a full house when he kicked off the THK Forum. There were some great keynote speeches by Paul Polman, who's a well-known advocate for sustainable development, Marie of the World Bank, who talked about the World Bank commitments and the new funding instruments they have, and a strong call to action, or should I say a reality check from Jeff Sachs about the need for rich countries and rich economies to really live up to their commitments and also to free up and invest more of their capital into the Sustainable Development Goals. So discussions are ongoing, but also focusing again on digital access, on health and recovering through the pandemic, as well as broadly on sustainable development. But really good and engaging discussions with a strong call to action to take up these blended financing models.
All right. Let's touch on a bit more delicate subject now, Ms. Sanda, because under Indonesia's G20 presidency, I also mentioned at the beginning, amidst all of these geopolitical tensions, do you see that in a matter of 2 days, the G20 Leaders Summit will see a significant minds coming together from all of our heads of states to sort of find a common ground and to ease the tension? Putin is not going to be here, but he'll attend virtually. But at least we see progress towards that sector, achieving a ceasefire at least.
Well, I can't necessarily speak to the political agenda, but I may echo the words of the UN Secretary General, which is, but we as the UN really condemn war and really look for peace under the guidelines of the UN Charter. I think that's very important. The SG, as we do, continues to call for a multilateral approach to the way that the world functions, and certainly for business as a whole. So there is the hope, really, that we can move towards more of that multilateral collaborative spirit.
Right. I'd like to touch on the anti-corruption movement across the globe, so which is also something that has been promoted and endorsed by UN Global Compact. How did it go so far? Southeast Asian nations have been always considered as a region with the lowest or progressed in terms of the movements for anti-corruption. So what's the analysis so far, Ms. Sanda?
Well, you know, corruption is an ill or an issue that affects economies across the world. You know, what is the challenge with corruption? It represents actually just a leakage of much needed resources. You know, corruption at the highest level robs states and governments of money that could be used to invest in better public goods and better services. Corruption at the private sector level also just erodes profitability. At the SME section, it makes the ease of doing business much harder. And at the household level, it simply robs household of income. So, you know, corruption in and of itself is a real loss to the economy at all levels. Now, what we do at the Global Compact is work with companies first for them to better be able to understand the many shapes and forms of corruption, how they can protect themselves against corruption, take a stand, work collectively, because oftentimes it's hard for an individual business to stand up against corrupt practices, but easier for them to do in solidarity with others, and also work with governments, with trade bodies, etc., to make sure that you can put barriers that make corruption just not the right thing to do, because the economic and the social losses are massive. So there's some incredible work that's being done, including by our local chapter here, our local network, around a collective action for anti-corruption. And it's a journey, it's progress as we go along. But I just want to highlight, corruption happens everywhere, in the public sector and the private sector, because it really does take two to tango.
Right. Is there any some sort of lesson learned or lessons exchanges in between countries, those that have been very successful in tackling the issues of corruption in their country, as opposed for those who are currently struggling for that particular crimes and matter in the country?
Yeah, you know, if I can speak to the work that we do at the Global Compact, because we work in a number of countries across the world on this specific project, which is on anti-corruption. There's lots of good and promising practice. You know, in some countries, I know, you know, in Kenya, for example, the private sector worked very closely with the Attorney General's office to create the first ever piece of legislation against private sector corruption, and that has been a model that has been used, has been understudied elsewhere. I think there's lots of learning and exchange. I think what's really important, though, is building the collective, so that collectively businesses and individuals can speak out against anti-corruption.
All right. Ms. Sanda, I'd like to touch on one of the pillars proposed by the Indonesia's presidency, which is the sustainable energy transition. This is an issue that's been a challenge for all countries and relevant to what you said, the climate change and reaching towards the net zero emissions. But the challenge also lies within the manufacturing and production sector in terms of technological switch and advancement. How do you think that UN Global Compact can better advocate this?
So a couple of things. I mean, I think, first of all, with the energy transition, as we know, you know, hundreds of millions of people around the world are without access to energy. And what does that mean? They continue to rely on perhaps less cleaner, greener sources of energy. It leaves them, you know, out of the opportunity to have good lighting at home, to cook efficiently, to study efficiently, to do their businesses on a 24/7 economy. So missing out on energy really keeps a large number of the world outside of the most productive parts of life. At an economic level, I think no country has ever really developed without a stable source of energy. There's lots of developing and emerging countries that are seeking to become middle-income economies. That will never happen without a stable energy supply. And that's why this energy transition is really important. You know, it goes hand in hand with the climate transition, where we're looking to decarbonize more, invest more in renewables and green resources. But at the same time, we need to be sure that we have enough sources of energy to power forward economies and the growth and the manufacturing sector, as you've mentioned.
Right. Another hot button topic that is also within the UN Global Compact, I should say, is the gender equality and embracing all of these marginalized groups of our society. Inclusivity is also an issue here during the G20 that has been put forward on the table, and involving people living with disabilities, ethnic minorities and others in terms of employment and business opportunities. Ms. Sanda, do you think that we have done enough vigorous efforts to advocate this as well?
No, we haven't. And the fact that we still need to put in effort means that we've got a long way to go. You know, you can take a look at panels and what composition and what leadership looks like.
Right.
And as long as the leadership doesn't really reflect our society, I don't think we're fully there yet.
Yeah.
We've got a long way to go, from political leadership to business leadership to societal leadership,
right.
to create a more inclusive society. I just believe that inclusive decision making results in much better inclusive outcomes, and we need to get to that stage.
Yeah.
Always say, let me use football as an analogy. You wouldn't play with half a team, so why'd we play the world and not have women at the table equally represented, or young people, or people with disabilities? I think we need to value a lot more of these marginalized groups and really get to not just listening, not just including, but having them around the table as meaningful participants.
All right, Ms. Sanda, we are aware that you are extremely pressed for time. Just one final question that I'd like to get your comment on. In a couple of days, the Leaders Summit will transpire here in Bali. What do you expect on behalf of the United Nations on how things will unfold at the leaders' table, and the handover also to India's presidency, or what to expect next year?
Yeah. I think for me, one of my desires, expectations would be one where there is a building of trust and a building of solidarity and a true show of unity for the world and for the global public good. As we said, it's been 2 to 3 years of global crisis. I think a united front within the G20 would be great. Lots of issues to address, as we said, from the energy crisis to the climate crisis to economies that are faltering. I think can only be resolved with a strong multilateral approach. The private sector, I think, is a keen participant towards some of these issues. So again, building on the B20, going into the G20, opportunities for private sector engagement, financing, innovation would be fantastic.
Some powerful notes there. Unfortunately, this is all the time that we have for our conversations. Assistant Secretary General and also CEO of the United Nations Global Compact, Ms. Sanda Ojiambo. Thank you very much for your time. It has been a privilege and an honor to speak with you.
Thank you for having me.
And G20 Overview will continue in just a few minutes. Do stay with us.